About to start. Are we okay? Yeah. Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. This is amazing. I'm looking out and it's all full. This is wonderful. This is way more than we expected and hoped for. Welcome. My name is Camilla. I'll be the moderator for this wonderful discussion this evening. And our discussion is actually on a bit of a serious issue, of course. Because what happens is when ice sheets melt in Greenland, the sea level rises in the tropics. So our sort of main question for today, and the one that we will be discussing in this wonderful panel that I have with me, is how does sea level rise and other climate changes affect life on islands in the Pacific Islands and in the Caribbean? And so tonight we will hear from these amazing guys representing the young voices. I'll also include myself in that, if that's okay. From different regions of the world, from different backgrounds, with different perspectives. And that's sort of the aim of this whole event, to bring all of these together and to discuss across regions, across perspectives and disciplines. And so I'll start by introducing this wonderful panel. So here we have Bernadette Tunidau, who just finished her postgraduate studies in sustainable development at the University of South Pacific in Fiji. And then we have Ozayr Akbar, who studies political science and law at the University of South Pacific in Fiji also. Then we have from Jamaica, Deron Maitland from the University of the West Indies, currently doing a PhD on sea level rise in Jamaica. And then also from Jamaica, Chauntelle Green from the University of the West Indies, doing a postgrad on coral reef rehabilitation. And then finally, Natalya Gomez, who is an associate professor in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department at McGill University in Montreal, doing research on the connection between ice sheets and sea level. So a very impressive group of people that we have with us here. So it might be fitting then to start sort of with just the overall topic of the event. And then maybe that would be good to then start with you, Natalya. As you do research on the interaction between ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland and the sea level rise. So on a global scale, I'm a social scientist. So can you explain to me what is going on?
Sure, yeah. So the ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica are sort of kilometers thick sheets of ice, the size of continents. And they are really dynamic systems responding to the changing climate, the atmosphere above them, the ocean around them. So on a range of different timescales, from icebergs breaking off really quickly to growing and shrinking over ice ages. And we see in a range of different types of evidence, from satellite data to measurements on the ground, that these ice sheets have been responding to recent climate changes. And melting ice that sits on land contributes water to the oceans, and so this leads to sea level rise. But it's not necessarily an even sea level rise across everywhere. It's not sort of this bathtub model where you put water into the oceans and it rises everywhere evenly. There are actually a range of different processes that lead to a really variable pattern of sea level rise. So the sort of first order effect is actually the effect of gravity. So an ice sheet exerts a gravitational attraction on the water around it. So when its mass shrinks, the local sea surface water sort of goes roughly where gravity tells it to, and the local sea surface drops. But you're still adding water to the oceans, and so you get a greater than average sea level rise farther away. And so for Pacific Islands or the Caribbean areas, low latitude areas, these are the areas that are far away from both ice sheets, and so seeing the greatest impact in terms of sea level rise from the melting ice sheets.
Deron, you're in one of those areas, Jamaica,
yes.
and doing research on sea level rise. How do you do your research? How do you measure sea level rise?
So measuring sea level rise, as Natalya stated, it's quite dynamic. Oh, first of all, thanks for coming. It's quite dynamic. So you have actually different types of sea level rise, which you could consider. The global mean sea level rise is what Natalya just gave us the broad overview for. But there's also relative sea level rise, which is really important for local areas because that is the change of the sea level with respect to that particular area. So to measure that, typically or historically, we've used tide gauge records, which are fixed to some extent, so you're able to gauge the level of the ocean change with respect to that particular area. And that could be significantly different from the global mean change. So that then allows you to plan for maybe adaptation a little bit better than just the broad figures. So that's one method. And also there's, in the Caribbean, there's a little bit of a lack of long continuous tide gauge records. So at least with technology now, with satellite altimetry, we're able to actually begin to have a look at quantifying sea level rise using a different method from those old long tide gauges.
Wow. You're touching on some really important things there, the differences in regions, right? Which
Yes.
is...
Especially in terms of data, because in order to do much of this analysis, you need good quality research, quality data, which sometimes is lacking in those smaller countries that don't get much attention, as let's say a USA or a Netherlands.
Yeah. Chauntelle,
Hi.
going below the sea level down to the coral reefs.
Right,
These are also affected by this whole system change.
right. So globally, coral reefs, they cover just a small percentage of the Earth's surface, but they're very significant. We would know that coral reefs are home to at least a quarter of all known marine life, so it's a very diverse ecosystem. In the Caribbean's reefs take up about 10% of that coral reef cover. To put it into context, in the 70s, the coral reef cover in the Caribbean was about 50%. Because of different stressors like climate change and pollution and coastal development, in the 2000s, it dropped to about 10%. Right now, it's about 15%. So that's at least 80% decrease in coral cover. So visually, you're looking at a less 3D reef. Usually, the more 3D a reef is, the more healthy it is. The better it's able to help with coastline protection. And to also put that into context, globally, about 2/3 of our population either live in the coast or within close proximity to the coast. So if you have healthy reefs, you're talking about reducing loss of life and damage to property. So we don't have that now, so we're looking at implications in the different ecosystem services that reefs will help with. So habitat for organisms, helping with coastline protection, supporting industries like tourism and fishing. We are losing the benefits that those coral reefs would have offered to us, and one of the main impacts is climate change.
Exactly. Now you're touching a little bit on the fishing and also the human consequences
Right.
On these. And I guess you guys here are more of a social perspective on these changes. And Ozayr, or Ozzy, as I'm allowed to call you, what interested you in studying climate and ocean issues from the perspective of political science?
Yeah, so like when you started off and you said you were a social scientist, I'm terrible with science and math, so I knew that I was passionate about making a difference, but I mean, we all have to play to our strengths, and I decided to let the researchers and the ones that are good at science to continue that and not make a fool of myself. And yeah, so I decided that I would pursue something in a different field that could still make an impact. So that meant getting into politics, into law. The political arena is very diverse and multifaceted, so there are many different things that affect other issues. So climate change is not just climate change, it's gender equality, it's making sure that people have food, it's reducing poverty. So, you know, it's all of these things that affect each other. And for the legal aspect, I come from a Pacific country. We have a lot of indigenous and local knowledge that we use to inform our laws. So that comes from having tambu, which is a taboo area for a certain period of time where you cannot fish or harvest a certain resource because that needs to replenish. And these are, codified in our laws.
Yeah.
And they're used as legal stances and legal approaches when we're extracting resources or, you know, trying to feed our populations. So yeah, that was kind of my approach when I got into it. It's to be the change without necessarily having to do the research.
Brilliant. We're also doing research, just different kind. And Bernadette, you also, you just finished your studies in sustainable development, which is, a massive subject. Where even to begin on that? How did you approach it? Do you have any particular interest within the field?
Yes, there's a lot of interest. First of all, Bula Vinaka, that's hello in Fijian. Thank you for all coming, and thank you, Skade and Camilla, for allowing us to be on this panel. I'm very privileged, coming from a tiny island across the world. Yes, so you've covered most of it. We the Pacific, we face sea level rise, we face coral bleaching, we face ocean acidification. And the main reason why I went into sustainable development is because of the environmental conservation side, the cultural preservation side, the climate change adaptation side, because our biggest industry is tourism, which brings in about 40% GDP. And so from the sustainable development perspective, we're trying to balance economic growth with environmental conservation and also focus on preserving our culture. And also with the climate adaptation, because we are very vulnerable to all this that's happening around us. We cannot really solely focus on mitigation. So what can we do to sustainably preserve our nature? And this can not only come from land, but from the ocean. So yes.
Yeah, how do we do that? And I guess you mentioned, the ocean being the connection in one way here between us, but also for this event, right? We're here for One Ocean Week, which I guess probably I see a lot of known faces, so I know that a lot of you are involved in some way or another. But the idea of having that one ocean, right? The connection between all of us, what we do here affects other places on Earth. Ice sheets affect other regions of the Earth, and so we're all connected from Norway to Jamaica to Canada and to Fiji. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have the same experiences of the ocean. So we talked a little bit about this before, and the perspectives, and not just from the discipline side, but also from the cultural and the social side. What does the ocean mean to us? And I think that's a very sort of good place to start, maybe, for a discussion a little bit on what does the ocean represent and what does it mean to us? I mean, socially, culturally, research-wise. Personally, Chauntelle, what does the ocean mean to you?
All right, so it means several things. I mean, as I said earlier, I usually wear several hats. So I can look at it from the research standpoint, where I'm looking at coral reef rehabilitation. How am I trying to add back, live coral cover to degraded areas, and how can I, restore, enhance fish populations, kind of thing. I can also look at it from a personal standpoint. I mean, I grew up in a large family. I have several brothers and a sister, and the easiest thing to tell a large group of siblings is to go outside and play. Yeah. So just take away that stress from the parents. Yeah, play with each other. So, my parents used to always take us on like country runs, drive outs, and go to the beach and so on like that. So Jamaica, I mean, we're surrounded by water, but believe it or not a lot of us like to go and explore the water. We love to go to the beach, but we don't really like to go and explore in the water. We literally stay like waist deep, and that's it. So, I mean, my parents sent me to swimming classes when I was younger, and I just had an affinity to the water. So we'd go to the beach a lot, and then I just kind of gravitated to the marine side of things. Yeah. So that is it for me. I mean, I also have it from a work standpoint. I work at a marine lab, which is on the south coast of Jamaica, and we do a lot of outreach where we take kids out, once again, because that experience isn't something that they're familiar with. So they may come for an environmental education tour or aspect. But a big thing for them is just being on a boat, because a lot of them have never been on a boat before or gone out to sea before. So that is a big thing for me, you know, allowing them to have that experience. So I would like to say that even though, as I said, we live on an island, we tend not to fully understand the connection that we have to the sea. And so one of the biggest things that I get out of it is just kind of improving or increasing how many persons can go out and get that experience. I would love to pass that on to, you know, another young person. So I would say that's what the ocean means to me.
That's amazing. I think if you put a Norwegian on a beach in Jamaica or anywhere in Jamaica, it's going to do a sprint for the ocean. Straight on.
When they came to Jamaica, you know, they were, my shipmates, shout out to all the shipmates that are here, they all went to the beach. I was like, I'm fine. I mean, I'm out in the water a lot, so I was like, I need land.
Yes.
But they enjoyed it. And I'm happy that they got that experience in Jamaica as well.
Yeah. 'Cause, I mean, I've never been to Jamaica. Darren, how does Jamaica look like? Describe Jamaica.
That's a
When you
rough
come sailing in, what do you see?
How much time do I have?
Oh, all the time in the world.
All right, so I'll put it this way. Jamaica is a very diverse island with multiple different types of microclimates. I mean, it goes from 0 all the way up to 2,256 meters at one edge of the island, I believe, which is the Blue Mountains. For all you Norwegians, the best coffee in the world comes from the Blue Mountains, Blue Mountain coffee. So Jamaica on a whole, what you see when you're either flying in or sailing in, I remember when we were sailing in on the ship, the first thing we saw were dolphins actually swimming alongside the ship coming into the port. So it's a really, really diverse ecosystem. The island of Jamaica is, of course, magnificent, best place in the world. No, when you sail in or when you fly in, the mountains definitely catch your attention, but also Jamaica is world famous for the sun, sand, and sea. So the beaches are absolutely stunning coming in from Eva Port, Eva side. So it then paints a picture of something that's extremely important and something that, as Chauntelle says, there's a lot of attachment to within the Jamaican people to the sea. So it's something that is really important to focus on protecting and sustaining.
Yeah, exactly. Ozzy, what does the ocean mean to you?
Where do I start? I think when you asked the question, I figured I was going to go around, and I was already thinking about it. The ocean doesn't necessarily have a meaning to me personally. It has a collective meaning. It's something that Pacific Islanders have approached as something that we share. So it's never just mine or just Bernie's or just Darren's. It's our ocean, which is, I think, why I loved the idea of the One Ocean, because it finally acknowledged the fact that we aren't divided by these borders and territories. What happens in one part of the world will affect the other. I've always loved the ocean. I remember this one trip when I was sailing with my high school to go do some conservation work on an outer island. We had these dolphins swimming beside us, jumping out of the water.
Sounds amazing.
It was incredible. I'd never seen that before, and it was like I knew that was something we needed to protect.
Yeah.
It was like a reassurance that what we were doing is right, and this is who we were doing it for. It's not just for humanity, it's for all life. And I think a lot of times we tend to get detached from the idea that, oh, we're living on land, so whatever happens in the ocean stays in the ocean, but that's really not the case. In 2016, I believe, we faced one of the worst cyclones of the Southern Hemisphere, and that just kind of solidified the idea that something needed to happen. I mean, I was only 15 at the time, but when you're that young and you need change to happen and you don't see it happening, you become that change. So that's what the ocean is.
Oh, gosh. That's good. That's very good. And, you know, just having you here is a sign of that connection. It's amazing to sit with all of you here. Bonnie, how does Fiji look like if you come?
Yes.
I mean,
I would love to explain.
Explain.
Of course, for those of you who have not been to Fiji, Fiji is a tropical country. It's hot throughout. It's about 25 to, it can go up to 35 degrees. People love to escape winter and come into the Pacific just to, get the experience, go back into summer. And I believe from that's where this sense of community comes from, because we're always outside because it's so hot. Yeah, it's so hot in Fiji. And that's why we love the ocean. If you travel from the international airport into the capital, you'll see kids swimming by the beach because then the road is by the coast. So that is Fiji for you, and we're welcoming you to come to Fiji and see the paradise. You can go swimming till 4 a.m. in the morning and not freeze your butts off.
You definitely freeze your butt off there in Norway.
You'll be totally fine. So that is my picture. That's the picture of Fiji I can give you. There's a lot of coconut trees and for the ocean, as Ozzy has said, we classify ourselves as we and not I. But we also have our personal stories. As for me, my surname is Tunidau, which translates to fisherman. So I come from an ancestral line of fishermen. And from when I was very young, my dad would take me out to sea and show me how there's certain ways that you fish, and there's certain things that you do also out at sea that is tambu. And so as Ozzy has mentioned, tambu is the restriction. You're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that. And I believe as from the sustainable development side, that's how we've preserved our ocean. And many of us have stories, and I'm really glad for this One Ocean expedition because it made us relive those stories that we thought was once lost. We didn't really talk about it in school. There was so much research, there was so much theories, but we didn't talk about our experience, our traditional knowledge. And this was brought about in this setting when we went out to the ocean. And we shared this with the Norwegian students, and they were amazed. And we also love the story from the students. Yes.
That's amazing. But I guess life, living so close to the ocean and being dependent on the ocean for so many things can be also, you mentioned a cyclone. There's also the threat of that, you have sea level rise, which is one thing, and coral degradation, and then you also have the storms, and how is it to live with that threat as well? I mean, that's also part of the ocean. I'm just going to throw it out there.
Okay. I guess I'll start. So Jamaica, as was stated, well, maybe it wasn't stated, Jamaica is tropical, and we do face the hurricane season every year. And if you would remember, or maybe you wouldn't, I'll bring it to your attention that the island has faced quite significant tropical cyclone passage in the past. And it's of particular importance because in a nation like Jamaica that is also quite tourism dependent, and where most of the economic resources outside of including the tourism resources are fixed on the coast, from Montego Bay to Ocho Rios, and even the hub in terms of business and finance in Kingston is also rather coastal. So in that setting where you have more than a quarter of all of your built land area for the whole country, and 70% of all of the resources coming in through, you understand that it's really, really, really important to ensure that these avenues and this location around the island is protected, because you could be not only cut off, but also there would be drastic loss of life and damage on the coast. And hurricanes have done that significant damage to the island in the past. So when we speak of actions to address climate change, it's from a perspective that it's a very real danger for us. It's not necessarily that well, the literature suggests it's not necessarily that hurricanes will be more frequent, but the intensity of these tropical cyclones will be significantly higher. And the Caribbean has already begun to experience those intense storms. So it's really important for us, whenever you speak of tropical cyclones, to emphasize that we may not be one of the major causes, but we definitely feel it quite severely.
Yeah. Yeah. Now we're talking about the impacts here. And Natalya, you're sort of, you have this whole, you have the world vision, because you do these big global systems that have very local consequences, as we're talking about here. And can you explain the consequences of sea level rise locally?
Sure, yeah. So first, thank you for all your answers. They were really inspiring. Sometimes, I see a lot of scientists in the audience, and sometimes I don't know who to be. Like being a scientist, and you're scientifically curious about how things like the ocean work, but you're also a person. I'm a person whose heart starts to beat faster when I get to the ocean because I'm so excited about it, and also a person who is really worried about what's coming and the impacts. So getting back to your question, so the impacts, one of the difficult things is that there are many processes across the globe that are contributing to sea level rise and impacts at a particular location. So we have the ice sheets melting and raising mean sea level, or the oceans warming and thermally expanding, and this, or ocean circulation that's global that will change in response to the changing climate. And this translates to a mean sea level change at a particular site. But it's not just that sort of maybe a smaller mean sea level change can still lead to a much worse impact, because a small rise in the mean will lead to the reach and impact of storm surges, say, being greater, or the frequency of floods, and so the reach of floods when we reach high tide being stronger, and so getting more and more to the point where we're overcoming the current protection mechanisms in place around the world. And so we're already seeing mean sea level changes and these impacts around the world now, and we can expect that those will increase in future. And the difference between one emission scenario, sort of a lower warming, or we really get to action and lower our emissions to zero soon, versus a less action path is a really big difference. And once again, the meaning for places in low-lying areas that are already experiencing the worst of sea level rise now, the difference of a small degree of global average temperature rise means a much greater impact for these areas than for other parts of the world, like Norway or
Because that's, if we're talking about, the global goal, the goal of the Paris Agreement, and you're sort of touching on that, right? So the global Paris Agreement goal is to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this doesn't sound much, right? It's not a lot when you hear it like that, but what are the consequences of that little 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius? What does that mean?
Yes, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put forward a report exactly on this question of what is the difference between 1.5 versus 2 degrees warming, and that's because it's a really important issue. So we will see global impacts of this, changes in biodiversity, in sort of mean temperatures as well as extreme temperatures around the world, ocean acidification, sea level rise, and some areas are going to experience more of these impacts than others. And so on average, while it sounds like a small change and some places won't be as affected, the places that are once again already experiencing the issues it will make a big difference to their livelihoods. And so I think that small, I guess we talked about this before, the sort of IPCC term is small island developing nations, but I think we prefer big ocean states here. So big ocean states have played a really big role in bringing 1.5 degrees to the table and fighting for it and getting that. We were talking a lot about 2 degrees, and now we're talking about 1.5 as well. So maybe maybe others have something to add to that. The Ozzy or
In terms of that same point about 1.5 to stay alive, a research group that I work with back in Jamaica, the Climate Studies Group of Mona, we contributed to that actual report by doing a bit of downscaling. That's essentially taking these big global climate models and figuring out what it means for the Caribbean region. So while doing that, we used an ensemble of about 5, 6 real advanced, real climate science, climate models. So, and we use those models to see what it really means within the Caribbean, not just taking from the global perspective. And what Natalya said, these impacts were really shown in some of that work. Definitely we see where it impacts not only temperature on a whole, but leading to longer periods of drought, for example. I digress a bit, but drought is a real issue if you have an expanse of land that doesn't necessarily have a lot of surface streams. So then water availability becomes an issue even in small island states, because seawater is great, but you can't drink that. So you have to think about that as well.
Yeah, I was just going to touch on explaining the large ocean state idea. So we're often called small island developing states. And today earlier we were discussing this, and we were like, who are we developing according to whose index? You know, are we developed according to the Western index or our own? I mean, if you ask me, I think we're very developed. We have very sophisticated forms of education and knowledge of ensuring our survival as humanity. Also, because we are large ocean states, we don't really need the ocean to get any bigger. Because, you know, the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees could be, you know, the inability to take any fish from the ocean to feed our populations. It could mean the difference between being able to plant crops on the coast or having to move further inland. It's the difference between being able to live on the coast or having to displace thousands of people, thousands of communities, and having to move further and further inland until we maybe don't even have land to live on. So yeah, that is just my little 2 cents worth.
Not so little. Very large, indeed. And, you know, we mentioned the 1.5 to stay alive. I think that's... So I was in Paris right after the Paris Agreement was, you know, agreed on, and we went out of the room, and the Pacific Island delegations were standing there cheering for 1.5 to stay alive because they had it into the agreement. And that is one of the most depressing yet happiest moments of my life. You know, you're cheering for 1.5 to stay alive. And it sort of describes this, you know, these international climate negotiations, we managed to get that 1.5, at least, you know, in the agreement. You guys, Bernadette, Ozzy, you've worked a little bit in COPs, with COPs. What are your takes on it? Maybe start with Oz.
I'm not going to lie, I'm a bit critical of large conferences and these meetings because a lot of times, like you said, it's depressing. We feel like we are seen as small states with small voices and small issues, so they don't really tend to have the impact that they need to have. Because we're these smaller states, because the ocean is encroaching so much faster on us, we feel it a whole lot more, but our voices aren't heard as much. I think that has changed a little over the past few years. I mean, we did chair one of the COPs. We've integrated indigenous and local knowledge into the IPCC, and it's slow and steady change, but I think the fear for a young person like myself is it a bit too slow? Is it going to happen fast enough for change to actually make a difference, or will it happen in a time when our states don't exist anymore because we have disappeared into the ocean?
Yeah.
I think Bernie has some nicer things to say, so maybe I'll let her take that.
Bernie, give us the nice version of this. Give us the hope.
I don't really have any nice version when it comes to this sort of. But just to go back to the impacts of climate change, because I've gone out into community reach, a bit of engagement with these communities that has had to migrate because of sea level rise. And just going in there and talking to the communities and seeing the cry of the people not understanding what's happening because they've lived sustainably. They live off the land, they live off the ocean sustainably, so they do not understand what's happening to them. And just to see the elderlies cry, and you know, we want to go out there and represent these elderlies. And so that cheering you see at the Paris Agreement is not only for ourselves, but for our community, the villagers that cry, that cannot be there personally, because they do not know what's happening. And this is why community reach and engagement is very big back at home as well. We go in, we explain what's happening, and it's so sad to see them lose their ties with their land, their cultural heritage, because that's what that's everything they know. And yeah, so from the COP perspective, we're just going out there and trying our very best to have our voices heard. But yes, for the land, for the ocean, especially for the people. Yeah.
Do you think people understand what's going on, sort of these global changes that are going on? I mean, I think people in Norway understand what's going on, even though we're trying to, educate as best as possible. Maybe in Fiji, and then a few perspectives on Jamaica after. Do people understand it?
Yes, they understand. So when we go out and have these community outreach and explain what's happening, then it makes sense to them that this is what's happening, that it's out of their control, they can't do much. So yes, they do understand what is happening around them. And they try their very best to integrate more of these sustainable things, hoping that it'll make a change. But then, sadly, they feel that they don't have a voice in much of these things, yes.
I would also go as far as saying that by virtue of being born in the Pacific, we're kind of, we grow up understanding what we're facing. I don't think there was ever a time where I didn't know what climate change was, just because it was just always something that we had to battle to inform ourselves about. Language can sometimes be a bit, I don't know if this is a word, gatekeepy. You know, the research that sometimes comes out, or like the reports, tend to have a bit more of a sophisticated or fancy language that might not be the most accessible to all people.
Yeah.
So, you know, educating and learning is a lot of just being able to reinterpret, to be able to explain in different languages. Yeah, so it's I think just by that virtue, we all do know the impact of what's going on. And like Bernadette said, we don't always feel like we've got the voice to make a change. But I think that's why we just need to scream harder and shout louder and chant more and make sure it doesn't get to that depressing stage.
Sit here.
Yeah.
Speak to the Norwegians.
Also, I wanted to just add one more thing. Throughout the expedition, I think all the Norwegians also know the impact of climate change. But talking to Pacific Island students, I think they were able to finally put a face to the issues that they were facing. So, you know, we all know that the climate is changing, we're facing a crisis, the oceans are rising, but maybe sitting here, you don't tend to feel it so much. It's not something that's affecting you immediately, but to talk to someone who's had to move out of their island because it's uninhabitable, to talk to someone who has never seen their homeland because it's underwater, to talk to someone whose home has flown off in a terrible cyclone, all of that, it allows you to rehumanize an issue that we've dehumanized too much.
Very well said. Very well said. Chauntelle, are people aware back home in Jamaica?
I would say yes, and I think the experiences are similar to Fiji. Thinking about what Deron said earlier in terms of drought, I can remember in my very short lifespan, once upon a time, you'd look at droughts happening and water lockoffs related to droughts just being like, okay, a few days out of the week for like a month or so. Nowadays, we're getting schedules of water lockoffs for most of the island. So we're seeing where that period is expanding. And most of our hurricanes, the most intense and costliest hurricanes, have happened within the last 20 years in Jamaica. So Jamaica is smack in the middle of the Atlantic hurricane belt. We are used to strong storm events and getting hurricanes. Even if we don't get a direct hit, once it passes close enough, we're going to see the impacts back home. So you can think about like governments sending buses to some communities to evacuate them, to say, okay, you're in a coastal community, you need to move away because you're going to get affected by it. And as I said, most of our communities are located along the coast. So you would have, I think, states or parishes, or what do you call it, provinces. We have parishes in Jamaica. And most of our capital cities and towns are coastal towns. So even Jamaica has a population of about 3 million persons. 1/3 of them are located in Kingston, the capital city. And you have a lot of coastal communities in Kingston alone. So if we were to get any strong natural events, you're going to talk about a big impact. So I would say that we do know it. It's just to figure out how we're going to adjust, and also make sure that we have more resources so that we can live with it, or move forward from it, I guess we should say.
Yeah.
And it's important to put a bit of scale onto the impact, because as Ozzy said, we really dehumanize when we put numbers on things. Sometimes you really dehumanize things. But on the coast of Jamaica, let's take the social impact of people being affected, but also, like I said before, we're very tourism dependent. Just 1 meter of sea level change will affect upwards of 13% of all the tourism resources.
Wow.
And if you have a storm that passes by, and the storm surge itself gives you 2 meters for that brief amount of time, you can imagine the amount of destruction and inundation just to those real tourism resources that we're dependent on. So then you think of how much recovery will cost and how much of a dent that makes on the GDP if this is an annual or every other year type of expense. So it's a cyclical
It's
type
massive.
of impact that comes with
Yeah.
it.
Wow. We are actually going to have a small 10-minute, I think we do 10 minutes break, so that people can go to the restroom and maybe the bar if they need. And then, we'll start in 10 minutes, and we'll also open, in the next session, next part will open for questions as well. So if there are questions. That was great. Yeah. Am I still on? Open.
Video, just up to you.
If I can please ask those people in the back to get ready for this next beautiful part of the event. And we were just saying in the break how much we love the crowd. So a big thank you to you. Because we love you, we want to maybe start with, if there are any questions. We'll have 1 or 2 questions maybe, if there are. Yeah, we have one already, and we have a microphone coming right behind you. And there's okay, yes. So, sir, you'll have to come up here. Be part of us now.
Yeah. Once again, thank you for this amazing panel to come and to sharing for sharing your insights. I think Ozzy or Bernie, one of you said something about giving this huge issue of climate change a human face. And that you kind of are these faces to us, and you represent this effectiveness. And I wonder, how is that in reverse? Are we, to some extent, also the faces of the West? And like when you see us, do you also see the consumption, all that we do, and maybe the bad things and the ignorance and all that comes with it?
I can see the...
What do you see?
Yeah, really putting us in a spot here. No, I was the one who said that. I don't think when we saw any of the Norwegian students or any of the non-Pacific students that we thought anything like that. It wasn't so much about putting a face to the dehumanity as it was just being given that opportunity to educate, to give an alternative perspective. So, we didn't see you guys as little horned devils or anything like that, killing the world. No, it wasn't anything of that sort. It was simply an opportunity to spread an education that we are living. So, yeah, we know that the people on that ship, the people here are passionate about creating a change, about combating the climate crisis, about saving lives and humanity. So, we would never have seen you that way. Yes. You can breathe a little easier and sleep a little better at night.
Just to add on to that, we're just as much interested in you just as you're interested in us. We learned a lot from the students of the ship, things that we didn't know back at home. And like we've mentioned before, we all have that call to the ocean, which is why we ended up on the ship. And we viewed you as interesting creatures, just like you viewed us. And we wanted to learn a lot of you. Yes. So you just have to add on to that. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, we flipped the table and made you the exotic ones. We were the normal ones. You were exotic to us.
Coming sailing in on a ship from around the world, of course. That's weird. Yes. Do we have another question? Yes, please.
Yeah, Bernadette, you had mentioned the elders in your community who, after living sustainably all their life, now had to be relocated due to the effects of climate change. How can large ocean states like Jamaica, like Tahiti, how can we cope, right? We know we have the climate agreement, but we have to live with the effects now. How can we cope?
Thank you for that question. The question really is, can we really cope? Are they really coping? They have no choice. And this is why climate advocacy is very important, because of the vulnerability that these elders and the community as a whole faces. They have no choice. They have to cope with the new place that they have gone into, but then they have to start over from scratch, because this is a different landmass. This is what grows here didn't grow back, so they had to learn to adapt. So in a way, they had no choice. They didn't cope so well, but they had no choice but to.
And I think to add to that, if we as big ocean states allow ourselves to succumb to that, we're twice defeated.
Yeah.
So we just have to cope. We can call for change and advocate, but we also have to make sure that we adjust to become a little bit more resilient in the face of climate change.
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking to coping, I mean, we've kind of always been coping by adapting, but like our language has been shifting very slowly, like a lot later than what we have been doing. Sorry, pardon me. You know, we've seen language change from the climate change phrase to climate crisis, because that wasn't enough to describe what is going on. We've gone from mitigation to adaptation because mitigation is not enough. So we've already been living those realities 3 steps ahead of the rest of the world, which comes back to, you know, is the world going to change fast enough? Are we going to cope fast enough?
Natalya, what is the role of science? And I mean, we're talking about climate action and advocacy, right? And this is so important, but it's also important for science, the research side of it.
Yeah, so I guess one challenge as in science is that scientists studying, say, the ice sheets, it's very far from the personal impact of the effects of ice loss. And it's very hard to relate. It's really easy to disconnect, to sort of dehumanize your work. I make ice sheet models, and so I work at a computer, and that's very far from a coastline and the people who live there. And so I think developing these relationships are really important. So there are many ways that science serves decision-making and action. We can contribute to understanding the state and future state of the Earth system and contribute to reports like the IPCC reports. We can educate, do outreach to educate the general public. We can work with governments to inform local decisions. But one thing in the sea level rise community, we recently had a conference from the World Climate Research Program that connected sea level scientists to coastal practitioners. And there was such a disconnect because it's difficult for a scientist to really understand what is the problem that's being faced and what is the information, how do you need the information to be able to make decisions. So things like the One Ocean Expedition that are connecting young, the next generation of scientists and people of all different disciplines is really, really important. And something that Ozzy was saying is it's great for maybe people in Norway or Canada to come to where you live and see and be able to carry that with us to either back into our lives and our work, but also equally important, maybe more important, to have representation among the people who are researching and making decisions from the places that are the most impacted by climate. And so we have a panel here today, and this is a start, but I think it's really important to keep pushing for that to be able to make better decisions faster.
Yeah, exactly. Chauntelle, Deron, I mean, what's the role of young researchers in this? Can we do advocacy? How does climate action look like for Chauntelle?
All right, so there is a role for everyone. We're experiencing climate crisis, as Ozzy said, just like every other global citizen. We are adding a different perspective. We have platforms that we can utilize. I mean, nowadays social media is a thing, and we're all connected. The world seems smaller through a cell phone if you're gonna advocate and get that knowledge out there. I mean, we do a lot of outreach where I work at the Port Royal Marine Lab. So we usually get about 4,000 to 5,000 students every year. Those tours usually involve some environmental education aspect where we can teach them something related to the environment like mangroves or coral reefs. That's one way you can speak about advocacy and activism. So I think I can leave it at that for now, but I would say there's space for everybody, for young people and having platforms to communicate that science to them.
Yeah, I think that's very, very important. And Deron?
I just wanted to add to that because this is a very big thing for me. I don't like the image of climate advocacy, which almost denotes that you must be outside with a plaque on a government building or tying yourself to a fence somewhere. I completely disagree with that image as the face of what advocacy is. I think, as Chauntelle said, everybody has a role to play. I will not be chaining myself to any fence. but my work could contribute to the science that really helps to bring perspective to how climate change is impacting a specific area. And using that work, then the activists in the boardrooms and in the people in the places of power, they have information not just to say, okay, this might do this might do that because it's affecting the world, but then they can say, okay, they can point to my work and say, this will happen in this particular place, or this may happen in this particular place. So it's not just a broad brush type of thing that's affecting everybody. You can then have the ammunition then to fire at the politicians saying, okay, well, science says this might happen here. Maybe more, maybe less than somewhere else, but at least then you have a perspective from your area then, which gives you more than just standing and say you must do something. No, don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking the advocates who go out and do that type of thing. Of course, that's amazing. It brings a lot of attention to the cause, which we need. So I love that for them. But I'm saying not everybody is going to do that. And that's okay. That's really okay. That's all I'm saying.
Climate action and work can be different things. It can work in different ways.
Yeah.
And I think one each has to find your own sort of way to work and be active and do the activism that is most useful for yourself.
And something that Deron's said many times is that advocacy takes many different forms. I mean, you can be a parent and be an advocate. That's just educating your kids. You can be a community member. You can be a teacher. You can be someone on social media. You can be a researcher. I mean, you could be someone studying politics. You know, learning how these systems work and how to change them, what sort of impact humans are having on the world. Like, all of this is still advocacy, even if it's not that mainstreamed idea of, you know, tying yourself to a tree. So yeah,
I think that's a very good point. Bernadette, what's the role of youth sort of in all of this? I mean, you've been quite active in prepping for the international negotiations and so on.
Well, I agree with all of you, but I take it from the media standpoint of view. I feel like with media, there's so much going on, but from that you can raise awareness. And one thing that we also talked about was integrating traditional knowledge with science. And this can also be carried out through media, all this storytelling that took place on the ship. And we have our own form of reaching out to people. But then we also have to think about the monitoring and evaluation. How much impact do we actually leave that people actually take in with them? We could just do so much as an individual, but but then as a communications officer back at home, that's one thing I also look at. The monitoring and evaluation, be it how much impact we've put out to the people out of advocacy. Yes.
I think you're touching on something really interesting there, because, I mean, and hard. And I'll tell you, I know that you've been working, I know you're eager to say something as well, because please, how have you been working to just connect the science to people?
Yeah, so one of the things that, building on what you said, is that we're not doing this alone, right? The goal is for everyone, wherever we need climate action everywhere at every level. And so the goal is to find your skills and find what you bring to the table, what is your position of power, and how do you bring that together with other people to work together who have different skill sets to bring it to the table. And I think that can really come into play in education and sort of train the next generation of leaders and people in the world to be able to take that approach.
Absolutely. And speaking of next generation, Chauntelle, I mean, you're doing lots with young children, and I mean, that's a whole different group of trying to communicate what's going on. I mean, the massive issues such as, you know, climate change and ocean change and everything, and how do you communicate that, and what's going on with the coral reefs?
So how do I communicate it? As I said, we usually get a lot of school groups at the lab. So one of the main science communication platforms is through those environmental education tours. And a lot of it actually happens behind the scenes in terms of the prep work, because I would usually dialogue with the teachers to find out, you know, what is it that you're coming to us for? I'm not just gonna come and just speak about everything that I know. I need to know exactly what it is you're hoping to get out of visiting the lab. And so we usually take persons as young as 4 years old, and we go all the way up to teachers, colleges, and universities. So we may offer a mangrove tour, a mangrove boat tour, but that mangrove boat tour looks totally different to a 4-year-old versus a teacher's college student. So a teacher's college student may want to know, how do I communicate to teach my students? But a 4-year-old may just want to know, why is this forest important? So I have to do a lot of prep behind the scenes before they even arrive. And then I'm a visual learner, and the environment tends to be a very graphic visual place. So I can tell you about mangroves and say, okay, mangroves are trees that grow in water. There are a lot of trees that grow in water. All right, so I'm going to take you out on a boat.
Norwegian, that's crazy.
Exactly. So I'm going to take you out on a boat, and I'm going to take you into the mangroves themselves, and you can see firsthand why the mangroves are important, what kind of animals live in the mangroves. You can also see what's happening to the mangroves surrounding our marine lab. So a lot of the teachers that bring their school groups there, they're hoping to accomplish something out of the teaching curriculum. So for example, a lot of the teaching curricula will say, study the marine ecosystem or a marine ecosystem. Some of the schools may not have the resources to adequately pull that off. So they literally come to us and tell us, all right, we just need a boat tour. We need a mangrove boat tour. And we tell them, okay, if you come to us, we will deliver that part of the curriculum for you, and you don't have to worry about teaching that afterwards. And a lot of the teachers say once they come to the lab, they don't have to deliver it afterwards. So that is one of the big things for us at the lab. But of course, we do summer camps as well. So I mean, usually you have your staple summer camps of drama and music and
Well, of course.
yeah, I mean, you don't really have a lot of marine camps where you can go out snorkeling, because as I said, you know, we live on an island, but we're not really adventurous. All right, so we're going to take you out to sea, and we're going to teach you about why it's important, but we're also going to teach you about the threats and what you can do to have your individual impact on the environment. So, I mean, a lot of outreach goes on, and I'm happy I can communicate why the environment is important, and one person gets it, I'm fine with that. That's really the highlight for me and my objective.
Super important. And I think I love how we've been on all levels, to all people, all disciplines, and all kinds of groups of people now, and doing that outreach. I mean, you represent everything there. So I want to open up the floor again to some questions. Do we have any questions to these guys? We have some coming in from out there. The internet?
Do that first.
Yeah, sure. And then...
So this is from our listeners out there. So one says, this is Terry Ann Brown. Yeah, go, Deron. So you probably know who that is. But the other one, Leonard, yeah, that's watching you from at home, perhaps. To the extent that most of the regions represented in the discussion are agriculturally dependent agricultural, it would be good to hear a few thoughts on the economic impact and the mitigation strategies.
Okay. Do you want to start, or should I?
I could. So, as Karim said, the agricultural sector is a big sector in Jamaica. Most of the farming may take place or concentrated in specific parishes around Jamaica. And when you have extended periods of drought in one of those parishes, you're going to see issues with food availability. And so you'll hear of things, prices going up, which they are now. We're experiencing a period of drought in Jamaica. And a lot of the farmers, when they come to the market, they tell you that the prices have gone up. So you look at their livelihoods being affected. If I am, as the consumer, can't afford to buy how I used to buy, I'm affecting you, the farmer, who is providing that food to me. So there are several initiatives that the government has tried to implement in terms of having, water availability to the farmers, or having farmers markets where they can get rid of their produce in a quicker period of time. We have also tried to scatter, for want of a better word, where the farming takes place, so that if one area is affected, at least you have these backup parishes that can provide those same foods to consumers. So those are real things that we are living back home right at this current moment in terms of periods of droughts and forest fires. Forest fires is another thing. Usually when I was growing up, you'd hear of a few forest fires in like March and April when it is windy. This year, I remember seeing a forest fire in the early parts of February. And these are some large fires that can wipe out, farmlands and even residential areas for persons who may live in the more interior communities. So those are some things that we have to consider as well, not just the ocean part of things, but what's happening on land as well.
And just to wrap that up, just to bring that to a conclusion, we spoke before about tropical cyclones, that those aren't very good for agriculture. So the government, I'm assuming your government has this tough job as well, to really invest in that agricultural sector annually. When there is broad brush destruction of the agricultural crops, the farmers then would need either subsidies or some type of investment to replant that crop so that it could come out to the food that the population needs. So that's an additional expense. The agriculture is an additional expense that is brought on by different impacts of climate change. But people need to eat, so don't have a choice.
I'll just add on to that. Because agriculture is the second biggest industry, but our first is tourism. And when that is affected by this high intensity and increase of cyclones, people lose their jobs. Many people lose their jobs, and that's one of the biggest economic impacts, yes, for tourism. Is people losing their jobs, because then the resorts have to close for a few months, and even a few resorts shut down, and they're like, no, we're not coming back because of the increase of storms.
Yeah, and usually the result of that is people will go back to their traditional values, and they'll learn how to plant again, and they'll go into farming just to survive and sustain themselves. But then what happens when those avenues of survival are damaged as well by those very climatic issues that are affecting, the tourism industry or any other industry? If your soil is too salinated to plant anything, then you're screwed.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Yes, please, in the back. I think maybe if you can come up to the microphone so the people online, the ones following Deron in Jamaica, can also hear your question.
Yeah, so the economic repercussions that you've been talking about obviously bear a huge brunt not only on the communities but on the governments of your nations, which of course are already perhaps disadvantaged compared to the large nations of the Western world. We're talking about Europe and North America predominantly. And so how do you think that these nations should be held responsible or help? Because, like Natalya said, or like science, the data shows, a lot of these intensification of storms or sea level rise are concentrated in the tropics.
I think I could slightly tackle that. Again, from the politics side is, I mean, you're asking about this in terms of a fairly novel issue that we're talking about now. We could go back to many other long-standing issues, colonization, capitalism. How do we hold them responsible in that area? And if we couldn't do it then how do we do it now? Yeah, I think a lot of it will be recognition from the side of those larger states that enact those issues in the first place. I mean, talk about the amount of microplastics you'll find in the Pacific Ocean. We don't contribute that much to those plastics. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, not mostly created by the Pacific, but we own it now. And again, like a lot of these states will not acknowledge the fact that they are responsible for creating it because that doesn't look too good on their resumes, does it? So, yeah, I think the first step would probably be us shouting a little louder and them acknowledging what they have done.
Yeah, I to some extent agree with that, and maybe Bernadette can talk a little bit more about this. But a part of the shift in the policy or in the methods in which we make this global shout at these climate conferences is to really open the discussion about loss and damage, not just about adaptation and mitigation. So you'll see the term loss and damage popping up a bit more often in these type of climate forum. And it really is to kind of nudge that idea along that, okay, somebody is responsible and loss and damage must be considered, not just adaptation and mitigation.
Yep, here was there. Are there more questions? If not, I have, of course, a few that I would love to ask you guys. No?
Yeah, there's one.
There is one. Yes, please. So I think this will be the last question then.
I think it's also just a follow-up, and maybe you know about that or anyone, but I was wondering now the topic of bringing countries to court because of the amount of CO2 that they're emitting is a thing that is becoming more and more discussed in media, at least. And then I know that, for example, now in Switzerland, I think there's a group of mainly female seniors that came up to bring Switzerland to court because they're not having enough or not doing enough action against their emissions. And do you know by any chance if this is also something that is discussed in your islands and how good the chances are to bringing other countries to court?
So, yeah, the moment you said that, I was like, yes, I can answer this question. Yeah, so we've got a panel of students from the University of the South Pacific and I think some neighboring universities that have taken this to the ICJ to hold. Mila, if you could help me out with this.
And what does the ICJ stand for?
Oh, the International Court of Justice. My apologies. What exactly was the question, if you could? Oh. That they're posing to the ICJ.
I'm not on panel here.
Mila
University of South Pacific. I teach politics there. Ozzy is my student. So I guess this is just fair that he takes me here to answer the hard question. So you might have heard that 2 weeks ago, United Nations General Assembly decided that the International Court of Justice, the World Court, has to give advisory opinion on the relationship between climate change and human rights. Now, that project started by students like these sitting in front of us today in 2019 at the USB Law Campus in Vanuatu, where the students wanted to think ways to make world listen to them. And it was a course assignment. And then they started this whole big movement, and they got Vanuatu government involved, and Vanuatu took it on board because obviously students cannot take the case to UN to discuss. So they got politicians involved, and yeah, that happened 29th of March. And now, of course, we have to wait a bit, and we don't know what ICJ is going to decide, but that makes all of us at USB obviously extremely proud of our students.
That's great, thank you. And absolutely underlining the importance of young voices. I mean, that's the best example there is. Thank you, Mila. Okay, so one final question for the final few minutes that we have. Quick, same question to all of you. If there is one thing that you would want the audience here to take with them from tonight, you know, what would it be? Natalya, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think coming to the voices idea of the title of this, I think if we can leave here and listen, remember these voices, find ways to amplify them, hand them more power, and really allow yourself to be different because of what you've heard. Stories is such a powerful way of sharing because it's so personal and it really sticks with you. And so think about what we can do differently because of the stories that we've heard today.
Yeah, that's very well said. Chauntelle?
It's actually two, but if I say it really fast, it will count as one. The need for collaboration within countries and between countries.
Yeah.
And understanding that it's not the environment or the economy. They go hand in hand, and we need to understand that balance.
Absolutely.
For me, I've been then thinking about this question for quite a bit. And I think I came back to that thing that I feel really strongly about. Everyone has a role to play, and every role would look different. Don't devalue the role you can play because it doesn't look like the role that gets media attention. Play your role in the best you can to achieve this sustainability and to protect this global resource of the ocean.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Ozzy?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar to Deron about taking action. And, you know, that action may take different forms.
Yeah.
I mean, you do what is sustainable for you, what works best for you, but take action. Don't just sit aside and watch it burn and then say, oh, we wish we saved the world. And my second one was going to be critical. You know, be critical of the fact that your governments might not always be right. What you have learned may not be correct. What you've done forever may not be the right thing. Be critical in the sense that you have to adapt and learn and change, and that is how we create an impact.
Very well said. Absolutely. Bernie?
Well, for me, it's the connection with the people, with all of you. If I wanted to start something, especially climate advocacy, I know who to reach out to. Because it's not just I, but it's all of us. And we hold a stronger voice if I connect with people from bigger countries. Because we have all our different perspectives. And I'm glad to be here today because I've made all this connection, not only with you, but with the people here. And after this, I would love to get to know more of you so I know who to reach out to and have the connection with you as well, coming from the Pacific.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And that was an amazing end to this panel. And I want to thank you, everybody, the audience, for coming. I also want to thank the organizers here, Karim and Skada. Karim is sitting on the edge of his chair, obviously wanting to say something. So he's the organizer, I can't stop him.
I just want to thank the panel, but also advertise if you enjoyed this. There's going to be another panel discussion on the 27th of April at 7 o'clock. I think it's even in this room about indigenous ways of knowledge, of knowing, and how we can in times of crisis. I'm translating from Norwegian. It will be in Norwegian, and then on the 4th of May, also here, there'll be another one, and that's more on the connecting, which you might not realize. This is hosted by Climate Narratives Project at the University of Bergen, but there's a connection between the tropics and the polar regions. So we're going into the polar regions on the 4th of May. So stay tuned and come back. And thank you, Camilla, for a fantastic job.
And so just to get the final word, I think thank you all for coming today, and a big, big, big thank you to our wonderful panelists. Big applause.